Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the podcast, we actually have a special podcast. I'm joined by my Art of Procurement partner, Kelly Barner. Hey, Kelly.
Hey, Phil. How are you?
I'm doing good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine.
So what we wanted to do today is we actually partnered with Zip Intake-to-Procure earlier in the year to undertake a research survey. The survey was understanding the performance and relationship implications of the procurement employee experience. It's a survey that we ran back in the first quarter of 2022, and we finally published the paper and all the results associated with it. So what we thought we'd do today is just actually share a little bit about the findings in that report. Now, before we go into the findings, I do want to just share a little bit of context. So as we did the research, we wanted to learn more about the purchase request and approval processes, as well as procurement's related objectives and challenges that the respondents saw. We then wanted to explore how current employee experiences help or hinder procurement's efforts to drive the value-oriented outcomes we're always talking about, that we want procurement to be able to achieve, and also in how the employee experience impacts our ability to build strong relationships with the business. So with that being said, Kelly, let me come over to you. And if you want to share just some of the kind of headline findings that we got from the report.
Absolutely. So before I do that, though, a little sort of behind the scenes for everybody, because in procurement, we read so many research reports, right? But the fascinating thing, at least about how we do this at Art of Procurement, is that we truly don't know what the key findings are going to be until we dig into the data and figure them out. So although I'm going to share with you a few points that are our key findings, getting to this point and all of the digging through the data that you have to do to get there, it is so exciting when these things start to emerge as critical trends. And we had some great findings from this report. Okay, so you ready for me to hit them?
Yeah, and I just want to say as well that, digging into the data brings me back to the practitioner days of, when you kind of got these spreadsheets and numbers and you're looking and thinking, okay, what can I find out of this data? So it's actually, it can be a time-consuming process, but it's a fun process to look for trends in and amongst all the answers that we got.
It is, and you analyze and you analyze and you analyze, and then you pick your head up and you think, who am I and what day is it? Because you immerse in the data.
So what have we got?
Okay, so the big one, because you almost never have a 98% finding, so this is really important. 98% of the respondents believe that an employee's experience during intake to procure, so the time between when they've identified a need and they're actually approved to process that purchase, affects the impact procurement can have on the organization. So by us empowering other people to have a better, more frictionless, more transparent experience, it improves the results that we can deliver. So that was the biggest one, but there are a few others that are really important. One of which, this was a rude awakening. 35% of employee-initiated purchases currently require 5 or more different functions to approve them before they can be processed. So when you think about the feedback that we get around people being frustrated, that's probably a huge part of the reason.
Yeah, you look at the cycle time of a sourcing exercise, for example, and, the perception on procurement is always it's procurement's responsibility. And yet we know that there's interaction with so many different other areas of the business. That's a lot, it's a lot of purchases. The 35% is a lot that require 5 or more. So you can see how that really slows things down.
Absolutely. And then the last two key findings are sort of a pair. So the first one is that 77% of procurement organizations that report they are seen as being strategic advisors or partners to the business also provide a single centralized purchase request process.
Mhm.
So that degree of partnership and the ease and simplicity of the process go hand in hand. However, here's the catch: only 41% of the organizations that participated actually believe that they currently have a reputation for being a partner to the
Yeah.
business. So, although we can see this really tight correlation, it's still considerably less than half of procurement organizations that really are seen as being business partners.
Now, did that surprise you how the response to procurement professionals believing that they have that reputation for being a partner in the business?
So I wouldn't say it surprised me. I would like to know if we could ask a follow up. What are you doing about that? And
Hmm.
like, are you accepting this? Are you saying, oh, well, we're not friends. They find us frustrating, but that's our role and we own it? Or is there something going on behind the scenes where they're trying to improve that? No, were you surprised by the 41?
Honestly, I think it was probably higher than I expected. We ask this question, but we ask it in different guises
You
in
do.
a variety of different forums, and questions that we ask on LinkedIn and for LinkedIn polls, questions that we ask related to our events that we run. And while I think we have a tendency sometimes to overestimate our impact on the business, we have some findings from a couple of years ago. There's also times where that number is actually really low. I think maybe when we're being a little bit more realistic. So it doesn't surprise me that, by on the flip side, 60% of procurement professionals believe that they're not a partner to the business. I wouldn't be surprised if that number was actually higher. More than 60% that don't think they're a partner.
And yet, even within that 60%, we can sort of infer based on experience that it doesn't mean that all 60% are just sort of owning the fact that, the business doesn't like them. I mean, within that, you may have teams that are relatively siloed and somewhat
Hmm.
transactional. So, no, they're not a partner to the business, but they're still enabling the business from a shared services perspective. And then, of course, there's probably some percentage of organizations that are sort of governance and compliance first, that deliberately don't partner with the business because they're viewed as sort of like command and control. So even within that 60, we can acknowledge there's probably some different types of relationships. But most of us, I would think, I'll say, if I were still working in procurement, I would want to be viewed as a partner and an
Yeah.
advisor.
And what's really interesting, the finding before that you mentioned, the 77% of procurement organizations that report they're seen as advisors also have a single centralized kind of request process, which suggests a pretty high degree of correlation between at least believing that you're strategic and having a single place to go for the business to initiate a purchase, which totally makes sense. I mean, it's something we've been talking about for a long time. Whatever guise, whether it's in guided buying, whether it's in, self-sourcing, whether it's in the intake to procure process we talked about today in the context of this report, having that place to go where somebody knows, everyone in the business knows if I need something, I go here first. It has so many benefits, and it helps you address those stakeholders in a more strategic way.
Well, and I think it makes the point, I suppose, to borrow from Forrest Gump, because he's a well-known procurement thought leader. Um, you know, Partners are as partners do. And,
Yeah.
and so it's not just about procurement wanting to do what we want to do and prioritize what we think is important. It's about partner as a verb as well as being a noun. What are we actually doing to help the business get what they need? I think that's some of what we're seeing evidence of in this response about the single intake process.
Yeah, and we looked as we often do as well in these surveys that we do. We wanted to know a little bit more about challenges and what are the priorities of procurement leaders at the time that they answer the survey. And so, as we look at the results for that one, and it's probably no surprise to see that number one was managing risk and compliance,
Yes.
with securing cost savings pretty close behind. But actually, number three was increasing the speed. So increasing speed to purchase is something that's on the minds of the procurement leaders that completed this survey, more so than Some of the things that we may have been talking about last year around supporting ESG initiatives, which was interesting. That was 6th on the list, or increasing spend under management, which is often really high and top of lists like this that was below that speed. So probably the recognizance that we need to be able to move quickly and help our organizations move quickly, more so today than probably 2-3 years ago.
And it'll be interesting to see. I mean, the economy has been an enormous focus for all of 2022. And so it'll be interesting to see if this continues. But when you think about what a good intake to procure process achieves, I mean, certainly anything procurement touches should ultimately be about savings/value. But then alongside that, even though we're trying to empower distributed buyers to get what they need quickly and efficiently, it can't be at the cost of increased risk or poor compliance or loss of data or loss of insight into their purchases. So even though we had people rank these priorities, to some extent in the real world, it's about tiny little tweaks between if there's a trade-off in policy or if there's a trade-off in how a system is implemented, figuring out sort of which thing breaks the tie. That's probably how we're seeing these priorities play out.
Mm-hmm. And was it interesting that risk and compliance came the top, or would you say that, that's kind of expected just based on where we were in Q1 and, where we have been, obviously, the couple of years preceding?
Well, I think it's interesting that savings isn't at the top, and not because procurement is so traditionally associated with savings, but because we've kind of known that there were economic concerns on the horizon for, I mean, I say all of this year, but we've been watching since 2020, 2021. Yeah. We've been watching to see how global economies and national economies would climb back out of the disruption of the pandemic. And so again, it's interesting looking at this as sort of like a peek into corporate psyche. They're saying, okay, yes, we're concerned about the bottom line, but to me, risk and compliance is a nod to procurement's ability to impact the top line. Because if we let supply chains get disrupted, if we make some choice or partner with a supplier that allows the operation to stop, that to me is where the risk and compliance comes in a lot of cases. That's the top line that gets impacted. So saying that's first, maybe that's a little bit more evidence that we're doing a good job to align with priorities, top line first, bottom line second, and then speed and experience and ESG and all of those things after that. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and I kind of separate risk and compliance a little bit as I think about it as well. We think about risk in the more traditional sense of securing supply, but from a compliance perspective, it actually talks to that first answer about the 35% of respondents saying that they have more than 5 or more approval processes. So because there's actually more compliance requirements, that's requiring more approvers. And I don't think that's going to go away. I think that how we manage that is going to have to be a lot more streamlined, and that's where technologies like intake to procure technology comes in. But the need to get more and more approvals from a compliance perspective is probably going to increase rather than decrease.
And it's also going to change as different procurement organizations. You always make a valid point, which is there is no sort of one best in class. Mm-hmm. So all procurement organizations are evolving towards or moving into new categories of spend all the time. You think about risk and compliance very differently when you're talking about the traditional example of office supplies or some other indirect spend purchase. It feels very different when you're thinking about third-party legal services, or you're thinking about some type of IT investment that brings with it cybersecurity risk that you don't have direct control over. And so as we expand, especially, not that risk can't come through indirect spend, it absolutely does. But as we move into services and technologies that are more integrated with sort of the operational fiber of the company, you can start to see, okay, this is where it really gets scary. And so what risk and non-compliance mean in those cases, it's far more impactful to the company's ability to draw revenue.
Yeah, and anecdotally, I think we see from the consulting side of our business, there's far more priority placed on compliance from those legal, infosec, privacy teams than ever has been before. And again, I don't think that's going to, even if our focus on securing supply and then that side of risk management may ebb and flow based on, macro conditions, but also category specific conditions. I don't think the need to ensure compliance is going to go away. What's interesting to me is ESG initiatives actually coming number 6 at the bottom of that list.
Yeah.
And actually, when we look at the average, we kind of scored the responses, and you can see all these how they were scored in the report. But it's quite a difference between the managing risk and compliance and securing cost savings down to the answers that we got for ESG initiatives.
It is. And I think part of it is companies are in survival mode to a certain extent. But I do also think that as much as ESG has been part of how we talk, especially if you see connections to CSR, love our acronyms, in ESG, but maybe the connection isn't quite direct enough in terms of how procurement should change the way we work. I mean, certainly there are tie-ins depending on what company and industry and geography you're located in, that, okay, sustainability initiatives, procurement is familiar with that. Supplier diversity initiatives, okay, we're familiar with that. But ESG is so much bigger than that and so much more integrated and regulated, which is really scary. And so this may be not even necessarily that ESG initiatives are the lowest priority, as much as they're being driven currently by people outside of procurement. So there's some awareness, there's some activity we're doing on a limited level around like sustainability and diversity. But when it actually comes to sort of the big umbrella of ESG, that may be a maturity question that if we were to run this in 12, 18 months, 2 years, something like that, it would naturally be much higher in the list, even if the economy were the same.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We're still trying to figure out how we can bring value to our organizations from an ESG perspective in a lot of cases.
Yes.
And that, as you say, has to be, we've tried for years to initiate that at a kind of a bottoms up approach from procurement, and it's not really worked. At least it's not worked at scale. So it does require that top down kind of mandate and requirement, which we are now seeing. So that, as you say, that one probably needs to play out for another couple of years.
Absolutely.
Now, we did ask a question around, so we asked the question about challenges. Well, what about your processes, and are there obstacles in procurement processes that are affecting the experience that folks have when they're working with procurement? And so the question was, which of the following create challenges for you as a procurement professional? And we gave a list of 6 or 7 different answers to rank. The top 3 answers that we got, the number one challenge was our current procurement process leaves employees confused, frustrated, and in the dark as to the status of their request. Second was, I don't have one central place for employees to initiate a purchase. And third was, the perception of the procurement team is negative and it's hard to change. So it's interesting that we kind of accept that our processes are possibly broken, and we're not necessarily operating in a transparent way.
And yet it's not completely our fault.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it goes back to that 5 approvals.
Yes.
And we actually, and again, download the report. That's required reading. If you go back and look at it, it's beyond just how many people have to approve. It's who are the people that have to approve. And so one of the things that's been interesting as we've learned in going through this process is that procurement gets blamed for everything because we're thought of as the point of intake, the function that's responsible for that, when maybe finance is slow to approve, maybe IT is slow to sign off on some kind of InfoSec requirement, but we get saddled with the responsibility for the experience component of that. And so simply by shining sun on this so that people can see, where is my request hung up? Oh, look, it's not procurement. Even that right there goes to that third concern around changing the perception of procurement.
I definitely think transparency is a big answer, because we end up being the mailman, where a stakeholder wants to know where something is, and as far as we know, it's stuck with the InfoSec group in doing their assessment. So then we're going to them, we're waiting for an answer. Sometimes that answer may not be immediately forthcoming. It's coming back to us and we're just communicating it. And we've got so many other things on our plate that we probably forget to follow up on a lot of times until the stakeholder comes back to us saying, where is it? I'm still waiting. And then the process repeats itself. Now, when you multiply that by 4 different stakeholder groups who are all doing different assessments, you can see how it's hard for us to control that just from a communication and project management perspective. Having the ability to bring insight for the stakeholder so they can see, I think will go a long way to changing the perception of procurement.
I think it's good to make the argument that, we talk about self-sourcing and self-guided buying and all of these sort of distributed things a lot. And in my mind, I tend to associate that with the type of action that our processes and systems allow people to take on their own. But empowering people can just be offering information so that if they want to go check 100 times a day, has it been approved? Has it been approved? Where's my stuff now? They have the ability to do that. And you know what? If it makes you feel better to check 100 times a day, you don't have to call anybody. No one has to know that you're checking 100 times a day. So you can sort of lean into that desire to know. But that's a form of empowerment, even if you're not necessarily changing the action steps and the permissions that people have.
Yeah, it's and it helps us so we're not spending the time doing the chasing. What it also does is it enables you to start building KPIs with the groups that are doing the other assessments. So it becomes more transparent that how long things have been with different people. The clock starts ticking, so then you can build metrics against that so that everybody in the organization understands at least, well, it's going to take you 3 days for this assessment. It's going to take you 2 days for this assessment, or it's going to take you 5 days for this assessment. It's not all in this black box, which I feel that for the most part, the entire procurement process, including the approvals we need to get, is in a black box.
Yes. No, it definitely is. And I can appreciate why people find that frustrating. But if we end up figuring out that one of these sub black boxes is sort of the true holdup, then you say, okay, let's sit down as an organization. Let's sit down cross-functionally and talk about, are we spending the right amount of time on this? Is it too much due diligence that's being done for not quite enough risk? Do we need to fragment this process out a little bit? Once you have that information and everyone understands the challenge, then you can actually sit down and resolve it. But until then, it's just this enormous, massive a problem that nobody can quite get their hands around.
And so the third topic and the last topic we wanted to cover, at least in the podcast today, we asked around the process for submitting purchase requests. So the question was, how do internal employees typically initiate a request to purchase software or services today? And the top 3 answers were 62% actually submit a request or a ticket through a centralized system. So 62% are saying we do have a centralized place for people to go in some way, shape, or form. 49.5% also say that they contact the procurement team directly. So that would suggest that some of the people that have a centralized system, people aren't always using that centralized system if they're going straight to procurement. And then down in third place, and this was only something that we asked 4 different choices, was that they don't initiate requests, they just buy on their own at 17.9%. Any thoughts about those numbers?
So I actually think about, now granted, there's a little bit of variation in terms of respondents, but there's not much. So when you think about that 62% where you submit a request or a ticket through a centralized system, and then the basically 50% where people are contacting procurement directly, we know there's some amount of overlap. But we also know that embedded in those 2 numbers is the 41% of people where procurement is considered a strategic advisor or a partner to the business, which means that even some of the teams that have tried to improve the intake process and make procurement more accessible by even encouraging people to contact them directly, it's still not quite enough to be a partner. And whether there's still some amount of work to be done around transparency, speed, whatever it is, actually, to me, that makes the results in here so much more accessible to anybody that's trying to improve their intake to procure process, because you can still have one of these things somewhat in place and not totally be viewed as a partner to the business. I think it's an interesting complexity.
Yeah, and I should say that this one we asked people, it was a multiple choice, so people could choose
Yep.
multiple answers if they have, folks both contacting the procurement team directly, for example, and submitting a request or a ticket through a system. What it says, if the challenge that we have, and one of the benefits of a centralized system, is that we're always talking about the fact that as procurement, we get involved when it's too late for us to make a difference. And so, those that are contacting the procurement team directly, that may be too late in the process. So, as much as we can have a single kind of way that I need to buy something, as soon as, and this is what I've seen kind of best practice in organizations, as soon as somebody, a stakeholder or a business, somebody in the business has this thought, I need to buy something, there should be one single place for them to go to. And then that single place for them to go to will then direct them to, well, if you need to buy this, you just need to go and, go down to the shops and buy it. If you need to buy this other thing, you have to go and contact procurement, and here's the way for you to do that. And it's going to route you to the right person, so that there's not this indecision. Because generally speaking, I'd say that business stakeholders don't want to do the wrong thing, but they just don't know what the right thing is.
And it's so funny that you say that, because I was just thinking to myself, we don't ever talk about anymore? Maverick spend.
Mm-hmm.
That was the topic du jour forever. And I don't think, maybe I'm forgetting something, but I don't think we've talked about maverick spend with any level of detail or seriousness since 2018, 2019. So I do think there's a recognition, to your point, that if people are going to the wrong place, and if people are buying the wrong spec, or they're buying the right spec from the wrong supplier, it's not that they're misbehaving or deliberately making our lives more difficult. It's that there was a problem with our process or with our technology, and we have to give them the benefit of the doubt. They're just trying to do their job. So even that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I remember Tim Jones telling us in a podcast earlier in the year that, that in his view, there's no such thing as rogue or maverick spend. Mm-hmm. It's just that we haven't provided we haven't put the right opportunities in front of the buyer to buy what they need to buy. And so they feel like they need to do something for the benefit of the business. And it's just an interesting way of kind of looking at it, that because we think, rogue spend, that's a business's problem. The business is not understanding our process, rather than that's a procurement problem because we're not providing the business the opportunity to buy what they need.
And that does seem to be a benefit of this relatively new exercise of trying to think about the procurement experience, because it's not entirely the same as user experience, although that's involved because we do have digital platforms that we use. And it's not entirely a customer experience, although that's certainly part of it. But you can't think about providing any kind of experience and also hitting your own performance metrics and whatever your KPIs happen to be without sort of changing your thinking so that the customer is always right. And if something especially is repeatedly going wrong, you can't be thinking, boy, are our distributed buyers awful at this. No, that's probably not the issue. It's probably something that needs to be resolved centrally from a communications, from a systems, from a policy standpoint. I agree wholeheartedly with what Tim Jones shared. I don't think we can think about Rogue and Maverick and also provide an experience that makes people want to work with us and allows us to deliver the kind of results that we need to.
Yeah, and in my opinion, is procurement. We can't be strategic to our businesses if we don't focus on the procurement experience.
Agreed.
And I know I've talked about this in pods before. How the perception of procurement is driven by conversations that happen when the CEO and the CFO are driving to a meeting together, and they're complaining about, one of my team had this really bad experience of trying to buy something, and it's buying something and nothing. That's where the decisions are made on the value of procurement. And so if we ignore the procurement experience, then we're making our life a lot harder if we want to really be strategic.
Yeah, we're going to be confined to office supplies forever.
Yeah. And we wonder why, and then we make it because, 90% of the people in the business interact with procurement when they're buying really basic things.
Yes.
Because most people aren't initiating, I'm going to go and spend $100,000 on some new project, or $500,000 or $10 million or whatever that number is, based on the size of your business, 99% of people are trying to get hold of a laptop or a laptop bag or, a new whiteboard or something like that. And if we make that difficult, then, we shouldn't be surprised why they don't have a good perception of us.
No, and clearly based on what we learned in this study, it all begins from the moment of intake.
Yeah.
And the better job we do with that moment of intake, that's where I think we create the opportunity for ourselves to next time take a step back. And then the time after that, take another step back, so that we're truly eliminating this problem of procurement not being brought in soon enough, the same way we resolved Maverick and Rogue spend. It wasn't by changing the way other people think and behave. It was about changing the way we think and behave and the type of options we provide to the business. That's where we get the opportunity to make a difference.
All right. Well, with that said, Kelly, let's wrap things up today. Now, anybody who's listening to this the day that we publish it, Kelly and I, for the rest of the week, are going to be working on bringing together our Mastermind Live event, which is our next digital event, 2-day event on October 4th and 5th, which you are more than welcome, if you haven't registered already, to register for that. Just go to artofprocurement.com/mastermindlive. We're going to be talking about how we can start to really 10x the impact that we have in our businesses, and what that means. What does that mean to do that? How do we need to think about it from a leadership perspective, from an inspiration perspective, and a vision? And then what are some of the ways we can start using technology to drive those differentiated outcomes for our business? So if that's something that sounds interesting, if you're not able to join us live and you register, you get access to all the Watch Again videos as well. So that's artofprocurement.com/mastermindlive. If you're interested in reading the report, the research paper that supports the conversation that Kelly and I had today, then that's easily accessible as well in the resource center. You'll find all the links today in the show notes for today's episode. So just go to artofprocurement.com/podcast. You'll find the link to this paper. You'll find the link to Mastermind Live, all there. So with that being said, Kelly, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure as always.
And we will be back next week at the same time, next Monday. Take care, everybody. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, an event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.